All right. Well, we are going to be in Genesis chapter. We'll spend quite a bit of time in 49 and 50, but we'll start in 37. That's where we're picking up today. We'll go pretty fast through these first several chapters, but probably spend most of our time in 49 and 50. There's a lot of other things that we'll talk about because today, Lord willing, we will also be finishing up Genesis and just kind of tying a bunch of things together here. And I'll say this again at the end. Hopefully I'll remember, but just in case, I'll say it right now. We're going to do Job next week. We'll plan to do Job. I know that is a lot of chapters. That's 42 chapters in 1 week. It's like, 6 a day if you do start today. But yeah, again, I'm not trying to give you homework or whatever. I think it's great if you can listen to it. That'd be great, or skim through some chapters. Or if you want to take the time and read those 6 chapters a day or whatever and try to get to Job, but we're going to try to tackle that in a week.
Why are we skipping? So, if you mind me asking.
Good question. So Job chronologically happens during the time of the patriarchs. We're not 100% sure. We'll talk about this when we study Job, and I'll show you some specific verses that kind of why scholars think that. But probably he would have lived right before or during Abraham's time. And what I'm trying to do is, as much as possible, do chronological without separating books out. So I didn't want to do here's part of Abraham and sneak Job in or something like that. I thought that would have been weird, but we'll hit Job right after because he's within that same time period, roughly.
I wonder if that's why the read your Bible through in a year that we have downstairs.
Mm-hmm.
I did Genesis, a little bit of Exodus, but I was doing Job too.
Yeah, yeah, that's probably
So
why.
Yep.
Yeah, it's chronological.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, it's neat, and that's actually one of the points that I wanted to bring up today is that so often, and this is not to blame anyone, but sometimes the way that we teach through the Bible, if we miss out on the chronological stuff, or if we miss out on tying everything together, we get a very narrow view that ends up we miss some things. So as an example, this time around, as I was reading through Genesis and just kind of finishing Joseph, when I was getting to the story of Joseph, I was like, man, I've read Joseph so many times, and here we are, we're going through it again, and that's never a good place to be when you're reading the Bible, but that's honestly where I was. I was like, oh, Joseph again, and all the flannel graph images were coming into my head, from Sunday school and all of that. But by the end of the study, I almost cried. I was so close to on the verge of tears because I saw some new things, and I love it when God does that. And it was just kind of the perspective of doing this study this way and a number of things that God brought to my attention. So I hope that you'll see some really new things here. Believe it or not, this is also the second time that we have studied, second time we have studied Joseph. When I started teaching, we were finishing up Genesis, and so the second time through. But we're going to see some different things today. And I think it will be beautiful to you as you see it in perspective of all of Genesis, but also all of the scriptures. But before we get there, let's move through these first several chapters. We'll move pretty quickly. What I want to do here, we'll really summarize Joseph's life once we get to the latter chapters. So what I want to do is just kind of say, okay, here's generally what this chapter is about. Are there any questions? And then I'll do a lot of summary towards the end. So we'll just kind of do some Q&A at the beginning, and then we'll really get into the meat as we get into the end parts here. Okay? So we have Joseph is introduced to us in his dreams and in conflicts with his brothers. And this conflict really seems to be around this multicolored coat that he has. It's a really beautiful garment, very expensive garment as well. His brothers don't get one, he gets one. Definitely some favoritism that's happening here. Jacob, of all people, should kind of understand that this is going to cause some problems because, Jacob and Esau and that whole situation. Isaac was playing favorites with Esau. Rebekah was playing favorites with Jacob. That caused a lot of family disputes, but people never learn. So we have this situation here. Most scholars think, too, that he's being marked as the chosen one. And remember, Rachel is the one who has Joseph, and Rachel is the one that Jacob wanted to marry. But then Laban tricked him and gave him Leah. And then they had this dispute where the wives are like, here, sleep with my handmaid. Oh, well, sleep with my handmaid. And so this whole mess. But then Joseph is born. And so really he's like, this is my true heir because Rachel is the wife that I love. And so that is kind of a big problematic moment. It gets even harder then for Joseph when he has two dreams where his brothers and his family members are bowing down to him. Now, not directly, but that is the interpretation. We have sheaves of wheat that have been bundled up, and then they bow down to his, and we have the sun, moon, and stars that are bowing down to him as well. And very clearly, people, they understand this is what it's talking about. This is the interpretation. Okay, so that's kind of where we are in the beginning of chapter 37, and then his brothers end up selling him into slavery by the end of that, and that kind of sets things up. So I want to pause here. What questions do you have about this, or things maybe as you were studying it this week that you want to bring to our attention?
Reuben was the oldest brother, correct?
I believe so.
Yes.
Yep.
And how come he didn't have more influence on the other brothers when it comes to sale of Joseph?
Yeah, so let's go to that part here. Let's see. So verse 18, the brothers are seeing him. So this is premeditated murder here, basically, is that they are chapter 37, verse 18. The brothers see Joseph coming. They're there in the wilderness. They're like, let's murder him. 21, when Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, let's not take his life. Don't shed his blood. Throw him in this pit over there. And then his plan is he's going to try to, make sure that they don't kill him, right? But let's see here. They stripped him, verse 23. They put him in the pit, and then they sat down to eat a meal. 26, Judah said to his brothers, what do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites. Okay? Then, verse 29, look, Reuben returned to the pit and saw Joseph was not there. So Reuben must have taken a bathroom break or something. He's gone. He comes back. It's like, what? So didn't work out according to his plan. So he was trying, but didn't. By the way, it is shocking. Judah's the things Judah does in these several chapters, very shocking. And think about this. This is the kingly line, eventually, right? This is the line Jesus will eventually come from. And so it's intentionally very shocking here, but it's also very raw and real about how we are like this as well. We are tragically sinful, and God is in the process of redeeming us. So even though Judah has some despicable behavior like here, like, oh, well, if we kill him, we don't get any money out of it. Guys, let's sell him into slavery. Wow, man. But Jesus is going to come from Judah's line, so there's some redemption there. Anyway, good question. Other questions or comments about this section? And we'll also note, we've looked at this before, I think last Easter when we looked at prophecies about Jesus. Joseph is also a type or a picture of Jesus being sold into slavery for 20 pieces of silver, Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So there's kind of a similarity there. There's many other similarities as we'll get into, but just wanted to bring that to your attention. Chapter 38, everybody's favorite chapter in Genesis. We have this very gross story here with Judah and Tamar and Onan and all of this kind of stuff. Basically, this is very fascinating. The Bible does this a number of times where we have a narrative inside of a larger narrative, and it kind of breaks up the flow, and usually what it does is it's some kind of parallel contrast. It could be a comparison between, here's this good thing that's happening in the midst of this other good thing that's happening, or here's some miniature lesson that relates to the larger lesson. That happens a lot of times in the Gospels. There's some really interesting stories within stories. Here we have a contrast between the righteous Joseph, who is following God and suffering on account of that, and Judah, who is just following his natural desires and is really kind of a despicable character here. Okay? Essentially what we have in this story is that Judah is, he impregnates a woman, and then he, let's just read some of this and we'll get into that. So let's see. At that time, Judah left his brothers, this is in chapter 38, and settled near an Adulamite named Hira. There, Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua, and he took her as wife and slept with her. And she conceived and gave birth to a son and named him She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. And she gave birth to another son and named him Shelah. It was at Gezib that she gave birth to him. And Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Okay? Now, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. Ouch. And then Judah said to Onan, go sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother. Okay? And so this is a very common situation in this time, to be able to take care of the family of the deceased brother's wife, to take care of her. The next brother in line would marry her. This was actually something that was put into law during the time of Moses as a way to protect women in the family. So this is something that they were practicing then. However, as we're going to see, Onan decides not to impregnate her, and so he gets killed. So the first brother gets killed, and then Onan gets killed. Okay, and so we have here, Onan knew that his offspring would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen on the ground so that he would not produce offspring for his brother. What he did was evil in the Lord's sight, because he's supposed to take care of her, and he's not. So the Lord killed him as well. And then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. Okay, so we've got three brothers. Dies. Onan dies because he's not taking care of her. Younger brother's too young to marry you, so wait a little bit. That's what he promised her. Judah is making a promise saying, hey, I'm going to give you this son. All right? After a long time, verse 12, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had finished mourning, he and his friends, Hira the Adulamite, went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she basically dresses up as a prostitute in the next couple of verses. And then he sees her there. She's just sitting there. He sees her and he's like, hey, sleep with me. Okay? And then he says, verse 17, I will send a young goat from my flock as payment. And she says, well, hold on a minute. What will you leave me as a sign that you will actually do that? Now, why is this even happening? This seems so strange. Notice that a long time has passed. Judah made a promise, and he did not fulfill his promise. He did not give his next son. And so she has been waiting this whole time. She's a widow. She doesn't have anyone to take care of her. So she decides to take matters in her own hand. And a careful reader of Genesis would go, ooh, anytime you take matters into your own hand, there's going to be some problems. Judah is also taking matters into his own hand, trying to protect his remaining son from getting killed, probably thinking, oh, it's the woman that's killing the sons, when in reality, it's their choices, and God is the one who's doing that. So she decides to take matters in her own hand by dressing up. He doesn't recognize her. He sleeps with her. Okay. So then he gives his staff to her as a pledge that I will come back and pay you. But then she goes off and hides. And now we get the rest of this story in verse 24. So he's tried to make payment, but the servant that he sent the goat with couldn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, hey, dude, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute, and now she's pregnant. Bring her out, Judah said, and let her be burned to death. It's interesting. What a hypocritical comment that is, right? Oh, a prostitute? Prostitutes are evil. I know I've used some, but this is who Judah is right now. So this is a very despicable person here. But then, in this last moment where she is confronting him, very, very intelligent woman, She says, verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message: I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong. Examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? And Judah recognized them and said, look at this. She is more right. That word is righteous. She's more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son, Shelah. And he did not know her intimately again. So here's his repentance moment. There's already some redemption in Judah throughout this despicable thing with what she did. He realizes she had to go to that length because I promised her my third son. I did not deliver on that promise. I was wrong and hypocritical. And so then he starts taking care of her, but he does not sleep with her. And what that is saying is basically like, I am now honoring you as a woman, and I'm not taking advantage of you again. Okay? Wow. Okay. We'll finish this chapter up, then we'll open it up for some questions here, because maybe you have some. But this part is really interesting. Verse 27, when it came time for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. Sound familiar? As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, saying, this one came out first. But then he pulled his hand back. He's like, nope, I'm not coming out. So then the other one comes through. What a breakout, or what a breach you've made for yourself, she said. So they named him Breach, basically, is his name, Perez. What a great name. Then his brother, who came out with the scarlet thread tied on his hand, was named Zerah. And so, again, this is kind of the older serving the younger. So he brings his hand out first, kind of creates this path for the younger one to go out, just like we've had the older serving the younger. So just kind of continuing that motif. This is the author's way, Moses' way of kind of hinting at the fact that, I mean, this is true, this did happen, but it also hints to the fact that this is the messianic line, that older serving the younger motif. So though this chapter is very difficult, it's also one that ends with kind of this redemptive element to it. Do you have any questions about this chapter 38? Or additional comments?
Was it normal for him to, would that have been a normal reaction for him to send her back to her parents as a widow to wait? Was that what the custom was? Or would she have resided in his household normally?
That's a good question. I would think that he would have her in his household to take care of her.
That's kind of where I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, the bride price and all of that.
Uh-huh. Now, I think the families potentially could also be a good provider. We see that with Ruth when Naomi's two sons die. Ruth and goodness, what's her name? Ruth's what is it? Orpah. Thank you. Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah to go back home to their families, because she herself, her husband is dead,
Yeah.
so she can't take care of them. So in that situation, it's like, well, okay, your families can.
There's no
Yeah,
male there, but there is the
Yeah.
potential here.
yeah. I would think that it would be common for him to keep her and take care of her. So this is very
That's
clearly
his first
he's not.
mistake against her.
Yeah,
First strike.
exactly. Yeah.
So
It's-
when you have like unbelievers or people that we believe God intended one woman, wife and husband and all this, and then you have stories like this. How do you justify
Yeah.
what God intended in all of this?
Yeah, it is a difficult one. So we see in Genesis that God gives one man and one woman, and it's this really holy thing. And then we see that after sin is where that starts to get broken. And there's this period of time where God is kind of silent on it, but every time you see a man with multiple women in Genesis, there is always problems. It never goes well. We see Lamech, when he takes, that's the first time that it happens, when he takes two wives, he's celebrating murder in song. It's like having a rap battle about how he's killed this boy and proclaiming it to his two wives. Abraham, when he takes Sarai's handmaid, Hagar, that creates problems. So every single time. Then what happens when we get to Exodus, we'll read in the law that God then, he makes the law more clear at that point. And so I think that that is his way of basically showing us what happens when you have broken that. And that's one of the things too, when we looked at when Adam and Eve sinned and God said, on this day you will surely die, one of the first things that died was their marital relationship. Their perfect marital relationship broke down. Adam is immediately like, oh no, it was Eve's fault. Right?
She did it.
Yeah, and so there was conflict within the marriage. They were hiding, they were covering themselves up, right? There's those kind of things. So I think that is during this time period, though it was common, it's not something that the Bible's condoning. So,
And most of the people that we read about, like Abraham, the second chance.
Mhm.
God's like what he talked about today in the sermon.
yeah,
To
exactly.
get a second chance.
That's right. Yeah, God redeems this all. Yeah.
It's kind of an off the wall question, but who documented all this back in the time before the flood?
Yes.
I mean, and how was it preserved? And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, they didn't have scribes back then, did they?
Not in the same way that they would during the time of Moses and following, but let me share some stuff with you. This is really cool. Give me a second here. We'll do a quick survey of Genesis. Look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. These are the records of the heaven and earth concerning their creation. That word record is toledot. Now let's go forward a little bit. There's a point to this. Let's see here. I think it's chapter 4, maybe? Chapter 5, rather. This is the document containing the family records, toledot, of Adam. Okay. We'll go forward again to chapter 6, verse 9. These are the family records of Noah. Then we'll go forward again to chapter 10. These are the family records of Noah's sons. And we could keep going like that. I believe Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have a section labeled that way as well as Joseph. And so these are the sections divided up by the records of these families. So here's then what we can put together, is that these families are likely, so maybe think Adam, for example, at some point is writing down what is happening in his family line. Some scholars would say probably they're not writing it down because of what we see from history is that writing emerges a little bit later in the timeline, but they are passing it down orally, which is why it rhymes in terms of parallelism and repetition. I think we talked about during Isaac and Rebecca's time, like, why is there so much repetition? They repeat the entire story like 3 times. It's because these people are memorizing it and passing it down, their family records. And so when we have Moses beginning to write it down, what Moses now has access to is he has these records that probably then, instead of just being handed down orally, were then at some point documented. So he has this document of Joseph's family and Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. And so he's compiling all of these into Genesis. Then he goes back to Noah, and he's got Noah's, and he goes back, and he's got, what was the one before that? Adam's line, we have Noah's sons, then we have Noah, okay? Then, isn't it interesting that suddenly it changes, that very first one we looked at, it wasn't the record of a person, it was the record of creation. Wasn't that interesting? But then, we have this really interesting one. Well, what about chapter 1? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so this is God's record of creation. And so if you think about it, it's like Adam, they're handing these stories down, but the very last, or the first story, God himself dictates and provides, because he's the one who was there at creation. Adam was there for his events. Noah was there for his events. Their sons were there for their events. God was there here at this one. And so Moses compiles all of that and creates this document. And when you study and look very carefully, you see there's several occasions where it says very explicitly in the scriptures, in Exodus, in Numbers, in Joshua, in Samuel, and a couple of other places. And they wrote it down and added it to the law. And so they are in the habit of documenting the things that God is doing. And so, though it's not really explicit in saying, and then Adam wrote this down, it seems like these sections were records that were passed down through the family lines.
So they're oral, and then they became written
That's right.
later
Yeah.
on when writing became more.
And it's possible because, it goes back, I was looking at a timeline for Job, and depending on where you place Job, there's the earliest writings that we have, we're not really even sure, like, it seems like writing just suddenly magically appears in the timeline, but you have to think too, well, the flood destroyed everything. So at some point, like as time goes on, this is where we think writing originated, but maybe writing was actually earlier than that. Maybe they did document it, even though oral traditions, but maybe they had to rebuild the understanding of how to build paper or something. Who knows?
Is it possible to have record put on the ark?
Exactly. This
I mean,
is
you
the
have your family record.
Yeah.
It seems like, whatever.
Yeah.
God could do
And if you take, when we studied the book of Jude, Jude quotes from the book of Enoch. Enoch was a prophet that was also the one that God took up and translated, right? So the book of Enoch, which is not in the scriptures, some people think was actually written by Enoch, but was not meant to be scriptures, but was some things that God was revealing to him. Whether or not you choose to believe that, was that written down? And Noah preserved it on the ark. Interesting. So from history, writing seemed to be coming after this time period, but could they have written it down before? I think so. People are incredibly intelligent and always have been. So arguably we're less intelligent now than they were. We just have more technology because we've had fewer major wars recently. All right. Let's move on. We are going to kind of skip over and summarize the next several chapters. You probably know some of the story of Joseph, but we're going to kind of skim over that. I'll ask you if you have any questions there, and we're going to focus on the ending. We have just enough time to look at that and then tie everything together. So we know that Joseph prospers in Egypt, even though he's been sold as a slave. What's really fascinating is one of the first stories of Joseph is one about sexual temptation, which Judah has just failed, and Joseph just passes with flying colors. And so it's really, that's why the story of Judah is placed right there. It could have been placed somewhere else, but that's really fantastic. Joseph also several times gets taken from a low position and moved to a high position, not because of anything he's doing, but because God is working in him. That is a lesson that is repeated. It's God who is doing this all the way through. Joseph is also very different from the other patriarchs because he is the one who is, he just seems to always be righteous. God is always working in him, and he's continually doing the right thing. Whereas Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob often are like, well, I'm going to do this to try to get God's will to be done. And Joseph doesn't seem to do that. Until his brothers show up, some people argue that the way he treats his brothers kind of harshly there, that maybe he's kind of playing with the idea of taking revenge. We could potentially argue that. But it's very clearly that Joseph is set apart as someone different who is making the right decisions because he is choosing to follow God despite what's happening around him. All right, eventually he is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and that is predicting famine. This is going to be a famine that is in their known world. So it's a how global it actually is, I'm not sure, but very much so that Egypt becomes kind of the center of the world because everybody's having this famine, including Egypt. But because of Joseph's wisdom from God, he is able to create a plan so all of the nations are coming to Egypt to get food. And that allows Joseph to come face to face with his brothers. Okay? So, as we continue to skip over, finally he's able to convince his brothers who he is and convince them to convince Jacob to come back to Egypt, and the whole family comes down. So let's pick up the story there. And again, if you do have questions on some of the other parts, we can come back to it, but I want to leave some room here. I love this in chapter 47. So Joseph went and informed Pharaoh, verse 1 of chapter 47, "My father and brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they own have come to the from the land of Canaan and are now in the land of Goshen." And he took his 5 brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Took 5 of his brothers, presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants, both we and our ancestors, are shepherds." And they said to Pharaoh, "We've come to stay in the land because there is no grazing land for your servants' sheep, since the famine in the land of Canaan has been severe. So now please let your servants settle in the land of Goshen." And I love this. Let's skip down to verse 7. Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Isn't that interesting? Here's this most powerful, arguably the most powerful man in the world, and Jacob, the shepherd, is like, "I'm going to give you a blessing." He's also very old at this time. So Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many years have you lived?" I don't know how old the Pharaoh is, but I'm picturing him as like a young 20-something guy. Like, "How long you been around, old timer?" And then Jacob said to Pharaoh, "My pilgrimage has lasted 130 years. My years have been few and hard, and they have not reached the years of my ancestors during their pilgrimages." So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and departed from Pharaoh's presence. The reason that I focus in on this one is this is another example of the promise of Abraham being fulfilled. Remember how he said he was going to make him a great nation? And we looked at how Abraham was interacting with kings. Basically, he was a major player during a world war. We had all these kings that were rebelling against an emperor, and Abraham had 400 men that went to rescue Lot with him, and we saw him as kind of this major player, and it was amazing. Like, wow, how did this humble man from nothing end up acting like a king? And now we see that the other patriarchs had interacted with pharaohs, they've interacted with Abimelech in Canaan, and now here Jacob is like, "Oh, okay, another king. I'm going to give you some blessings." It's usually the one who's higher up that blesses someone lower. And so it's really an amazing situation. But also notice his years. He very clearly is stating, "My years are less than the previous patriarchs." Remember, God has numbered the years of humans, and we saw from Adam and some of those early men, the years started to decline, and now we're getting into the low hundreds in here, or right above 100. I believe Joseph actually lives to maybe 110, 145, somewhere in there. We'll see that here in a little bit. But then after that, it's going to be much shorter lifespans. Okay. So what then happens is the Israelites are now set up and ready for the Exodus. In a couple of weeks, we will get to that and we'll explore the Exodus, but they're there in this land. They're safe. And this brings us to 2 really important chapters, actually 3, because we got to see some stuff in 48. So let's look at this. Sometime after this, chapter 48, verse 1, Joseph was told, "Your father is weaker." And so he sent with his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay? So you may recall that Joseph is not a tribe of Israel. And so that's kind of interesting because all of his brothers are tribes of Israel. Joseph is not. Well, this is the story of that. Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you." And so Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. He said to me, 'I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you many nations from you, and I will give you this land as a permanent possession to your future descendants. Your 2 sons born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simeon do." This is important here. So now we realize Joseph is actually going to be 2 tribes. this is really interesting because, number one, even though Jacob was favoring him and giving him this coat of many colors, God is also marking Joseph out specially because Joseph has followed him righteously. So Joseph gets a double portion of the blessing. Okay, so as the father is providing blessings to his sons and apportioning out the inheritance, he's basically saying, Joseph, you get 2 shares because I'm not counting you, I'm counting your 2 sons. So that's a really cool reward that's happening here.
And they're half Egyptian.
Yeah, and they're half Egyptian, which is also interesting because Joseph's actually married to a high priestess. Yeah. Children born to you after them, this is verse 6, will be yours and will be recorded under the names of their brothers regarding their inheritance. Okay, let's continue down here. Okay, verse 13. Joseph took both of them with his right hand, and Ephraim toward Israel's left, with his left hand on Manasseh toward Israel's right. And so he's basically bringing his sons in proper birth order to Jacob, and now called Israel. And Jacob's eyesight is very poor, very similar to his father Isaac in that situation. And so we have a duplicate series of events here. Israel stretched out his right hand and put it on the head of Ephraim, the younger, and crossing his hands, he put his left hand on Manasseh's head, although Manasseh was the firstborn. And then he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who's been my shepherd. Note that they are shepherds. God is the shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd. A lot of beautiful things coming together here. All my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm. Isn't that amazing? Because all the despicable things Jacob has done, we looked at his life being redeemed. May he bless these boys, and may they be called by my name and the names of my father Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow to be numerous within the land. And when Joseph saw his father had placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was a mistake, and he took his father's hands and moved it to Ephraim's head instead of Manasseh's. Joseph said to his father, not that way, my father. This one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a tribe. He will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than him, and his offspring will become a populous nation. And so he blessed them that day, putting Ephraim before Manasseh. He said, the nation of Israel will invoke blessings on you, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. So that's that story. Okay. Any questions or comments on that section before we move to the last 2 chapters and close things out here?
Well, it didn't have anything to do with the quality of the brothers, did it? It was strictly birth. I mean, it was strictly Jacob's choice, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because he has not lived with these boys. He doesn't really know much of their reputation, right? So it's not what they're doing. Yeah, it's his choice. Probably directed by God himself, because Jacob has finally learned the lesson. And so he's doing this deliberately. It wasn't because his eyesight is poor, but because he deliberately knows he's going to honor God this time. Yeah. Chapters 49 and 50 bring us to the end of Genesis. They also bring us to the end of a major section of biblical events. This also parallels the previous major section that we were in. So we've been kind of walking through a biblical timeline where we see creation. That's kind of one. Then we have the fall as another major event. Then we go into the flood. And the flood actually has some really interesting parallels here. Do you remember that when Noah was about to die, he gave a prophecy over his 3 sons? And that prophecy shaped the way that nations, the nations that came from his sons, would interact, and we talked about that. Jacob's final words as he blesses all of his sons now is going to do the same kind of thing. And so during this time of the patriarchs, this is where we are right now. This is also where Job would fit in before we move into the next phase of our history here. During the time of the patriarchs, we're about to close this section off. And so just as we close this one with a prophecy that was global in scope, this one is also going to close with kind of a global prophecy, a very long historical lens. And both of these kind of, well, I mean, you could also argue that this one predicts the Messiah in Genesis 3:15. There is some messianic qualities here in the flood. Peter corresponds it to baptism and the picture that baptism is of going under a flood and coming back up. Not that baptism saves you, but it's that picture of the cleansing that happens. But then here, we're going to get a beautiful messianic picture as well as we close out this section. So let's actually get into that. Okay, this is chapter 49 now.
So the patriarchs are like Isaac, Abraham.
Yes.
The basic.
Yep, and the reason they're called the patriarchs is these are like the grandfathers of the nation of Israel. And so really what's happening is this is global, the world, and this is all of humanity is now in a very serious, tragic position where we are sinners in the hand of an angry God. We are so sinful, God has to destroy the entire world. But then he promises back in Genesis that he's going to eventually solve this problem. Someone is coming. And so we start to see this line of families that are walking with God. And so we move from a global picture to kind of this zoomed in picture of these patriarchs that are following God, and we see the messianic seed. And so it's that story. What's fascinating about it, though, is that this small family, all these patriarchs, have global implications. They are creating nations, they're interacting with nations, they're blessing nations in figureheads. They are becoming second in command of Egypt in Joseph's case. And so it's kind of this interesting thing of, though there's this one small family following God, it's still relating to this global picture of salvation.
You said that they were the grandfathers of what?
Israel.
Israel. Okay.
Israel. So we're going to
Sorry.
So it really kind of sets up then the rest of the Old Testament of God's work in Israel. But then Israel itself, this big nation, though it has its origins in the patriarchs, always is interacting globally. That salvation comes from the Jews, and that ultimately gets capped off with Jesus.
So that's like the synopsis of Genesis, right?
Kind of, yeah. Okay, let's get into
Question.
yeah.
Okay, if the patriarchs are global and they're coming from one family, this is gonna sound crazy, but like, who went to the east? I mean, who went, like, and how did North America get, you know,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
The land
good
bridge and all
question.
that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
yeah.
How, I mean, why wasn't there any, family or, carryover, whatever, from the patriarchs through all the migration around the world, and later on, like God says, well, I'm going to forget about the people in the east, you know, the Asia and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah.
and the North American Indians, I mean, they had spirit God,
Mhm.
you know. I mean,
Yeah,
okay.
it's
You know what I'm saying?
No, I do.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm
for
sorry.
sure. And I actually asked that question of one of my seminary professors too, because I said it's really interesting. Like, God is focused in on this really small area of the earth, and here's
Right.
this other huge area. And he says, if you look through history, the whole earth is often very much affected by what's happening in the Middle East. And it really is kind of the central location of the world. It's a major highway of trade. That's why people kept fighting over it for thousands of years. It's a major road area, right? The Romans built it up with this, the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans built up this navigation system around there to spread. So God chose that as a central location where the gospel eventually comes out from and hits the whole earth. We do see in Genesis chapter 11 the table of nations as they spread out from Babylon. They spread across the globe. The scriptures don't really talk about the other nations beyond what the known world was at that time, but you can extrapolate that and say, okay, these people continue to spread this way, these people spread this way. What's really interesting, though, is that you see that God is telling us this story, but there's people like Melchizedek that just pop up, and you're like, we don't know anything else about Melchizedek, but here's this high priest of God. He's following the one true God. God had revealed himself to Melchizedek. And then Job, how is he connected? He seems to be in a completely different area,
Right,
and
right.
here he is following God. And so God always, he communicates. How he communicates is often a mystery to us. We have a few things, but we know that he cares about all the people on the world. What we also see is even the tribes that were eventually cut off in North America after the land bridge dissolved, and then it's like, well, where do they show up? They have flood narratives. The whole world has flood narratives. When I was studying a little bit of Job this week, I realized there are nations around the world that have Job narratives. Yes.
Really?
Yes. Some of the earliest writings we have are flood narratives and Job narratives. Now, they don't call him Job, but it's a man who is, it follows a very similar pattern. So, anyway.
So you think the Native Americans in North America just migrated across?
Yeah, there's
and-
very clear migration patterns.
And they
that
have a
happen.
flood narrative?
They have a flood narrative too. Yep. And their flood narratives also echo a land bridge. If you study that, So I used to teach American literature for a little bit, and we looked at Native American mythologies, and some of them seem like they're boats that they, like the flood narrative, kind of feel like a land bridge, like they go through the boats and they end up in a new land. And so it's really kind of fascinating. Anyway, that's
They're not
off topic.
needed a land bridge there's cities that are buried under the ocean. They keep finding more and more.
Right.
So
Yeah.
at one
Yeah.
time there was a lot less water. And
Also
maybe
that.
there was no, up at Alaska or somewhere,
Uh-huh.
they were able to walk across.
Yeah, most likely. And also, since they're more technologically advanced than we give them credit for, that some of them probably sailed across certain places too. So let's get into chapter 49 and 50 here as we round things out. We don't have time to get through all of these, but we focus on Judah because that's the kingly line that we get Jesus from. That's Judah's line, so we're going to look at Judah. But one might say, well, what happened to Reuben? What happened? Why is he not really, given that same kind of credit since he's the firstborn? Remember, we also often have that motif of the older serving the younger. Reuben actually slept with one of Jacob's concubines, and so you see in verses 3 and 4, because of that, he basically says, you're not really getting much of a blessing. Okay, so he's discounted. Simeon and Levi are interesting too. Simeon and Levi, verse 5, are brothers. Their knives are vicious weapons. Wow, that doesn't sound like much of a blessing. May I never enter their council. May I never join their assembly. For in their anger they kill men, and on a whim they hamstring oxen. So you remember when Dinah was raped? We actually didn't have time to look at that story last time I was with you. But it was Simeon and Levi who had the idea, let's tell all of these people in the clan that had raped our sister, let's get them all circumcised, so while they're recovering, we'll go in and we'll slaughter everybody in the village. So that's what they did. Okay? Now, check this out. Verse 7, end of verse 7, I will disperse them throughout Jacob and scatter them throughout Israel. This is very interesting because that's actually a statement of redemption a little bit here. They're not going to get a full inheritance. They're going to be scattered. Simeon, when you look in Joshua, which we'll get to eventually, when they divide up the land, Levi becomes the Levitical priesthood family, and they don't have an inheritance. They are scattered over all Israel so that you can have priests in every part. So they don't have a single place to call their own, which is a fulfillment of this prophecy right here. Simeon is actually given a small piece of land inside of, who is it? Is it inside of Judah? I forget exactly. So it's basically like Judah gets to kind of encompass and guard over Simeon, so that they don't get their own land, but they get kind of a parceled land. Okay, let's look at Judah. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion. My son, you return from the kill. He crouches. He lies down like a lion or lioness. Who dares to rouse him? This is cool. The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet. Now, your translations are going to vary a lot here. This is a very difficult place to translate. until he whose right it is comes. Some translation will say, until Shiloh comes. And the obedience of the peoples belong to him. So let's talk about that. I know that part is hard. It's hard to translate. But scholars, though they change and try to figure out, okay, what does this actually mean? We know what it means. It's just hard to render in English. Basically, the idea that's here is that kings are going to come from Judah, and they are going to be temporary kings until one comes who's going to be the ultimate king, and it belongs to him ultimately. Now, I believe that the very last king of Israel had something similar said to him. I came across this in my reading, and I didn't dig too deep into it, but basically the same kind of thing, that, you're this last king until the one whom it belongs comes. So same kind of idea. That's Shiloh. And so this is a prophecy of Jesus here. Judah's the kingly line, and eventually it's going to end in one. When we look at David and Solomon, there's also some similar prophecies given to them about an ultimate king who's coming. Okay. We're going to skip over the next ones, but all of them are fulfilled in a beautiful way in some form or another. It's really interesting. Let's see here. He has some nice things to say about Joseph. I think that is all that we need to look at right now for the prophecies. But if you dig into them, it's really fascinating to see what happens. Some of them, it's like, wow, it seems kind of more like a curse, and you realize that that's a line of people that eventually will fall into idolatry, and they're the first people to fall into idolatry. That's kind of neat too. But we need to move forward here to chapter 50, where we get the end of the story of Genesis and of Joseph, and this is the most beautiful thing right here. Let's take a look at this. We have Jacob dying and being buried. What's really fascinating in chapter 50 is the Egyptians, Joseph has them embalm Jacob. They mourn for him, and they actually mourn for him almost the same amount of time they would mourn for a pharaoh. It's 2 days less. And so here's this small man in their eyes from this small tribe of shepherds who the Egyptians despise, by the way. They hate shepherds. Joseph tells his family, don't tell them that you're shepherds. Tell them you're herdsmen. And then his brothers come up to Pharaoh and were like, we're shepherds. So it's really funny. But anyway, they mourn for him like a Pharaoh. That's, again, Abraham's blessing coming true. But now we have a problem, because the figurehead in the clan is dead. Joseph now takes charge. And his brothers did some pretty bad things to him. So they are now afraid for their lives. Now Joseph is second in command of Egypt. He's also the head of our household. He's going to kill us all. That's what they're thinking. Okay, you see that in chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said to one another, if Joseph holds a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the sufferings we caused him. So they send a message to him. And notice it causes Joseph to weep. This is in verse 17. His brothers also came and bowed before him in fulfillment of that prophecy. And they said, we are your slaves. But Joseph told them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Wow. That is who Joseph is. Also a perfect picture of Jesus. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. But doesn't this also really capture the essence of all of Genesis?
Yes.
Adam and Eve fell because they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They basically wanted to be God. They said, we don't need God. We are going to do it on our own. During the flood, humankind continued to rebel. And Noah followed God. The rest of the world was like, we don't need God. The patriarchs struggled with that, didn't they? Abraham followed God, but then Sarah was like, well, you're kind of old, man, so am I. Like, just sleep with my, handmaid over here. And we see that repeated. And we said how that links to the fall, where they decided to try to get God's blessing doing it their own way. Joseph is the only one then that says, am I God? Should I take matters into my own hand? I'm not God. Whoa. He does what many of these other men failed to do in leaning on God for his decisions. Similarly, the evil that resulted from the fall, Satan meant that for evil. God meant it for good, because he was going to tell us an amazing story. Humanity's sin led to the destruction on a global scale, but God meant it for good, Joseph's words. There was a lot of evil that happens in here. Judah, Abraham, deception with Jacob and Laban. All of that was meant for evil, but God redeemed every single piece of it. God meant it for good. And so these closing words of Joseph close off the entire book of Genesis as well and are linked to everything that came before it. Not only that, but don't you feel like that connects to all of Scripture?
Mm-hmm.
What you meant for evil, God meant for good, ultimately in Jesus Christ. All the suffering that happened to me, I forgive you. God meant it for good on a global scale, right? Jesus suffered on our behalf and was able to give life. It kind of echoes Paul's words in Romans, I believe this is chapter 4, where sin came in the world through one man and death through sin. But then we have Jesus who comes and one man gives life to all men. Isn't that what Joseph did? Where there's death and famine all around, and one man, through God, gives life to all who are in Egypt and the surrounding nations. Isn't this also a picture of the end times, when we are going through horrific times and Jesus comes as our Redeemer and Rescuer and brings all nations to himself, just like all nations are surviving this famine because they're coming to Egypt. And one man is helping to save them and saying, I will take care of you and your family, lead you into a promised land here in Goshen, the best land that Egypt had to offer. I've prepared a place for you. Come. Wow. So that's Joseph's story. If we take the flannel graphs of Joseph and we put it into the greater context, the greater flannel graph here, it all sings together and harmonizes. So let's end there, and then we'll be in Job next week. Let's pray. Lord God, I thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your faithfulness through all time. As is mentioned here, and this is a section that I forgot to go over, but if what you promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph is true here, we can trust you in the day-to-day now. We can trust you to fulfill your promises that you will return again someday, because you fulfilled all of these other promises 100%. Thank you for that. I ask that you would help us this week to live out your word. In your name, amen.